the paper of Henning Tegtmeier has the title "In Defense of Viewing Things Sideways On." Now the level of the whole debate is going upstairs. So it's a speculative paper talking about truth in the absolute sense, not what we were doing right now. We're talking in more concrete ways, even though they were abstract. In what follows, says Henning, I will argue that the image of viewing things sideways on, which many philosophers nowadays use to undermine or caricature metaphysical and naturalist account of reality, is such a misleading image. It's a misleading image to use that talk about viewing things sideways on or viewing things from nowhere as if it was impossible to do that, as this would mark wrong metaphysics. I suggest, or it suggests, that it is virtually impossible to abstract from one's own position in the world and one's own epistemic and practical stance over the linguistic and cultural context that one finds oneself in order to gain a neutral perspective. So Henning, the whole paper more or less tries to show that when we follow these abuse, as he thinks, of viewing things from nowhere is impossible, then we give up the very notion of truth, which we need, of absolute truth, beyond the mere plurality and skeptical way of subjective opinions and so on. So if we are still interested in objectivity and truth, and if we want to reflect on that, there is no way as to defend viewing things sideways on and from nowhere. In what follows, he says, I will challenge the way the image is used by many to reject the idea of theoretical neutrality. I will do so by engaging with how John McDowell introduced the image into philosophical discourse almost 35 years ago. So he is discussing John McDowell and describes how John McDowell wants to get rid of these viewing things from sideways on. I do not, and I do not want to go into all the details here, the comparison between and the difference between how John McDowell uses the term sideways on and how Thomas Nagel develops the view from nowhere. I just want to bring the whole idea together by saying the main claim of Henning Tegtmeier is when we do science, when we claim anything, when we talk about the world, we presuppose a neutral stance as in a certain sense possible. He totally agrees that it's not possible for me or you, but it must be in a sense possible or presupposed, or else it doesn't make sense even to claim anything, because my claim is that it's not just my opinion. I do not just express my feelings, but I just want to say it is rational, it is reasonable to agree what I say. So I appeal to this stance sideways on. I appeal to a standpoint looking on the world from nowhere, everywhere, or from, as I sometimes say, from the end of the world. And therefore we have to think about this objectivity and absolute truth, even though we know that nobody can claim to have it. So this is what he agrees. Nobody can have it. But what he does not agree is that we cannot talk about it. We must talk about it. We must talk about this idealized absolute standpoint, because there is no objectivity and no understanding of objectivity, and not even an understanding of assertion and claims, if we do not appeal to them. Even though in the paper he doesn't talk about God at all, traditionally the standpoint sideways on and from a point of view from nowhere is the divine point of view of all knowledge. That means knowing all. Of course, it in memory, more or less, of Hegel's point that absolute truth is just because any local thing stands in indefinite relations to all other things, and these relations are part of the truth of what it is, what we talk about. So you know one thing only if you know all things and all relations. Now, of course, processual relations in time, we could add. And therefore, when Hegel says that the true is the whole, it's just a logical remark that if I want to know any true singular case, I'm in a full sense, in this absolute sense, I must know all its relation to everything else. I must know all. This is, in a certain sense, a formal case. Of course, there is a contradiction. We know that this is only a side remark now, that this is not in Tegmeier. The side remark is Bertrand Russell would say, well, this is not true. Of course, I can understand 2 + 2 equals 4 without knowing all the mathematical claims. But that's not the point. The point is you cannot even understand 2 + 2 = 4 if you do not know the place of 2 in the numbers. The place of 2 in the numbers is, of course, it's bigger than 1 and it's smaller than everything else. But if you do not have these relations as a part of understanding the word 2, then you don't understand what we are talking about. And insofar, of course, I do not have to know everything in order to know a peculiar relation of 2, but I must bear in mind that the full understanding of what I'm talking about presupposes the possibility of knowing many other things also, all other things in principle. And insofar, Henning Tegmeier makes, in my point, in my reading of it, a logical point that, as the title itself already says, in defense of viewing things sideways on, the very notion of objectivity, the very notion of truth presupposes, in a certain sense, such a view sideways on. And so he is criticizing all those people who tried to get rid of the speculative reflection on this fact, and tried to reduce truth to either opinion, relativistic pluralism, or to mere procedures of proving, as in the McDowell or Paul Lorenzen case of mathematics, not McDowell, Dameton intuitionistic mathematics, where they want to reduce the Cantorian notion of truth to the to schemes of proving, because truth is transcending mere schemes of calculating. So we need an objective attitude, not only in mathematics, we need an objective attitude to the world. And therefore, if we want to do philosophy as metaphysics, that means reflecting on the very notion of knowledge and truth, we need to take this standpoint into account. And now I'm almost at the end of my presentation of what Henning says by comparing it to how I see things, because he has a passage where he attacks the Hegelians, and this is me here in his point of view, because he assumes that the Hegelian point of view is an immanentist point of view, which denies the possibility of looking at things from sideways on and even talking about it. So for him, this appeal to objectivity and absolute truth, or the appeal to a view on the world sideways on, seems to be, from a Hegelian or my point of view, immediate. It's a case of belief, or it's a case of transcending the immanence of my judgment. And my counter position, and this is where my talk then starts, my counter position is, look, the problem is not claiming or asserting truth from nowhere. Nobody can do that because we know that all our judgments are subjective, fallible. It's possible that we even don't understand the language correctly, that we overlook things or whatever. So the fallibility and subjectivity of our judgments must be accepted. The problem is that the very content of possible judgments is, even when it is objective, even when it is, it claims that it can be compared with a perspective sideways on, even though I know that it's fallible. Even in those cases, the very content doesn't transcend the immanence of fulfillment condition. The fulfillment conditions of a statement, of a claim, must remain immanent. They must remain our conceptual conditions, even though they are, in a certain sense, indeterminate. They are not fixed. We always have to bargain what belongs to the content. For example, when I say there is no milk in the fridge, and then you find some milk, but it is rotten, then you could discuss with me, oh, it is true that there is milk in the fridge, and you said there is no milk in the fridge. Then, of course, the meaning of there is no milk in the fridge I wanted to say is there is no drinkable milk in the fridge. So there is a bargain about, and there is a possibility to adjust the meaning of a claim in a dialogical game. But nevertheless, the very notion of truth, the debate if there is milk in the fridge or not, depends on a pre-settled question, what inferences we attribute to the statement, this is milk. And these inferences, which define the meaning of this is milk or there is milk in the fridge, belong to the presupposition of the very notion of truth, and they are still immanent. They are not transcendent. And this is exactly the way where my point of view and Henning's point of view go apart, because he thinks that we need a notion of truth and objectivity which transcends this only relational objectivity, which I would agree with and defend. And he thinks we must be able to talk about truth and objectivity really from a standpoint sideways on. From a Hegelian point of view, the debate is the debate of Kant's notion of Ding an sich, in a certain sense. Because Kant's notion of Ding an sich has one reading, and the one reading is, and it's explained by Kant. One reading is that we, not only I, we, all humans, understood as a joint subject, as a collective subject, when we agree with judgments, we still could all be wrong, because there might be a divine mind who sees everything feel much better, correctly, and therefore we all could be wrong. So from our point of view, we have a similar problem for intersubjectivity as subjectivity. That means intersubjectivity can be as subjective as mere subjectivity, and therefore the notion of truth, which stays immanent as human knowledge, can all be wrong. This is at least in some of Kant's reflection in it. And so the notion of Ding an sich talks about a kind of transcendent objectivity. And this is exactly where Hegel steps in and says, this doesn't make sense. Such a notion of Ding an sich does not make sense, because we would not even know what kind of fulfillment condition this would be. So it doesn't, either it is totally empty, it just makes a move like Kant's Ding an sich is just the same as the Spinozistic substance. That means it's the whole world, the manifold of all truth in the whole world, but without any definite fulfillment condition. So we do not at all know what kind of knowledge this would be. We do not even understand knowledge as the word knowledge, or fulfillment of truth conditions as truth, when we only use Ding an sich in that way. And then it doesn't help us, because that real reality, the whole, is indefinite, doesn't help me at all. And then the whole function of reflecting on the whole as the true gets empty. And I think this is exactly the Hegelian point of view. And insofar, our debate goes around the fact that transcending knowledge by a notion of truth, which can be ironically talked about only sideways on. That means we can only talk sideways on about the possibility of absolute truth, not knowing that we never can take the stance of it. Now we have the two readings. The one is, one claims to have such a point of view sideways on the real world, and I say we need a sideways on point of view of the point of view from nowhere. We can mention it, but we cannot have it. We can mention it in order to talk about the form of truth, but we cannot have it. And nevertheless, we can say the form of any truth must be relative to our conceptual fulfillment and satisfaction conditions. And what we know then is that the fallibility remains an immanent fallibility, objectivity remains an immanent objectivity, but it nevertheless has a general form. In a sense, and my talk is Metaphysics as Transcendental Logic and as Unreflected Belief, this title just would say that when we think about what there is, then in a second step, we had that already in the earlier talks today. In a second step, we come back to the question of making a distinction between subjective appearances, seeming statements, how things seem to be. So when we want to develop the notion what there is, what there really is, we come at in a first presuppositional distinction. This is the Hegelian move in the science of logic. A first presuppositional move consists in we need the differentiation between essence, object, and subjective appearance. So the first step of reflecting on the question what there is let us understand the difference between object and appearance, or essence and appearance. The second step is when we ask, and that's a correct question, what do you talk about when you talk about essence? What do you say when you say the real object that produces that appearance is this or that? The next step is the question of making explicit what we mean by being the real object, being the true object, being the true cause of an appearance. The next step is we need concept. We need the conceptual condition for the very notion of real object and being. And therefore, we have the following step, and it's two steps. The two steps are at the same time two steps in logical analysis and in metaphysical reflection. First step, question what is real, what is true, what is existing. We need the differentiation between appearance and essence, or we need the differentiations between object and seeming judgments or belief. And the next step is we need the step from essence to concept. And now this morning we had the problem of concept. It appeared in the question of conceptual renewal or conceptual reform or conceptual engineering. And the examples which were produced were examples that showed that quite often the word concept is just understood in a Kant and Frege way. Kant and Frege use the word concept and define it more or less, Begriff, as a property, as a content of a predicate. More or less the content of an arbitrary predicate, as if a concept could be being a number bigger than 5 or so, or being a prime number. If we look into the real use of the word concepts, for example, for titles of books, the concept of prayer, the concept of mind, the concept of law, then we see normally when we do not abuse the word concept in the colloquial way, where the concept is more or less just a word, yeah, in the colloquial use of it. Concepts seem to be much more than just a predicate and much more than word. They are whole domains of smaller concepts. They are whole domains of words and things, like, for example, prayer, or like, for example, law, or like, for example, justice, the concept of justice. So a concept is a domain we can talk about. And that is much more than a predicate. And therefore, there is a limitation of conceptual analysis to defining only predicates. Well, of course, in the debate this morning, Dasein as a title for human being has exactly this high-level concept, and therefore it's not the predicate. It's not the concept in the Fregean and Kantian way. And why is that important to make that distinction? Well, because a Hegelian concept is a genus, an eidos. It's explicitly the translation of genus and eidos as words used by Plato and Aristotle for explaining whole domains as forms, not only as a small form, but a whole domain of forms. The concept of number, for example, is a whole domain of number. And in a concept, in a Platonic Aristotelian concept or genus, and only in such a concept and only in such a genus, we can use the general form tikatatinos. We can use the form we say something about something. And Aristotle, in his Prima Philosophia, which later was called Metaphysics, which I read as the foundational level of reflection on what it is to have science. That means Philosophia in the traditional way is whole science. Prima Philosophia is the reflection on the possibility of having objective science or joint science. And in Aristotle's reflection on Prima Philosophia, which goes beyond the formal logic of syllogistics, one of the major themes is later called ontology, that there is not a unified science of all being, which is the expression of Aristotle for the fact that when we want to talk about things and judge about objective things, we already must presuppose these local domains of things which Hegel calls concepts, and reflects on the whole set of concepts by using the very general notion, the concept. The concept is just the generic way of talking about concepts. And now the problem is that we already presuppose well-constituted domains of entities when we want to have the usual judgments that something has the property or stands in relation to something. And therefore, when we want to understand metaphysics in the sense of from Aristotle to Hegel and Heidegger, I would say we are led immediately to this interesting question: how are these local idea, these local concepts constituted in which make it possible to say something about something? And that means how are the objects we talk about and the truth conditions for predicates attributed to the objects constituted? And here there is, of course, the formal analysis, which goes from Leibniz to Frege, saying that normal predicates, which now I call predicates and not concepts, normal predicates are function. That means when I'm talking in a certain domain about something, I presuppose that there are many different accesses, there are many different ways of representing the same object. That means I presuppose knowledge about identity of different reference identity of different presentations or representations of the same object. And I assume the Frege-Leibniz principle, which is the functionality principle, that what I'm allowed to talk about the object must be a distinction which doesn't distinguish finer than the representations of it. That means I talk about the object in invariance to different presentations and representations. So I'm already presupposed a distinction between naming and what is named, representing and what is representing, referring and what is referred to. So I presuppose identities, and I presuppose the structure of predicates which are able to talk about the whole objects in the domain. And this is a general form of tikatatenos, which is presupposed, even though it doesn't formally really apply for in a verbal sense outside of mathematics. Only in mathematics I can have full functionality, but this explains why the normal predicates are understood as functions, but only locally to the local domains. And this was, of course, a big step forward of Frege to see that they are functional. But in a sense, it's just the same as the insight of Leibniz. That inside, that when we talk about objects, we do not make differences between the different accesses. So from a logical point of view, the analysis of constitution of objects and the presuppositions is giving a local answer to what it means to have an objective understanding of our propositions and assertions. It presupposes that we already have the conceptual pre-knowledge of what counts as representing or presenting objective things. So we presuppose triangulation, as Davidson calls it, translations, when we go from interpretations to from a subject to another subject. And that means, of course, that now in a short remark to the debate about Davidson is right to say that from a subjective point of view, I do not know if your meaning or your interpretation is the same as mine. But we cannot talk about, and that is almost already against Davidson, we cannot talk about interpretation when we do not already appeal to some joint understanding, making differences jointly. So we are not interested when we talk about anything about arbitrary or subjective differentiations. We are interested in joint differentiations. And therefore Hegel is right to say the basic of all the basics of reference and all the basics of truth rest on our practices of making joint differences. And not making differences, these are the identities, is the very logical basis for being able to say something about something. Because identity is not making differences. Identities or equalities are not making differences. So the starting point is we use words as labels for joint distinctions, and we need the practical knowledge about how to do it, even though that we know that this doesn't work perfectly, but it works quite well. We appeal to our joint differentiations when we make claims, and we appeal to our not making differentiations when we say something about something, because we need and presuppose the identities of the objects we talk about, because it doesn't help you if you talk about the stars and I talk about the planets, or if you talk about animals and I'm talking about plants, then we don't have the same reference. And insofar, the Hegelian logic is a metaphysics insofar as it is a logical analysis of what it means to talk about something, that means to refer to the same thing and saying something about it. And he is adamant about this kind of language, this kind of being able to talk about, is the big difference between animals and man. So the basic difference between animal thinking and human thinking is the tikatatenos, is being able to have the practice of negation and negating negations. And insofar, the very notion of objectivity, the very possibility to refer to objective things, presupposes these practices. Things get even more complicated now when we look at the fact that a genus and an eidos is only a form. It's not, as in some analytical approaches, I think even in Quine and Davidson, in Quine, it's absolutely clear. Quine wants to reduce or to get rid of the complicated notions of concepts, meanings, and so on by sets. He thinks sets are nice because sets have nice identity conditions. Two sets or two references to sets are identical if they have the same elements. The problem is that there are no elements independently of the concepts, and there are no sets independently of the concepts. And insofar, Quine has a problem in his set theoretical ontology, and all analytical philosophy following the idea that we could replace the concept of sets is neglecting, and that is my unreflected belief, is neglecting the question, what are the elements you talk about? Unreflected belief in metaphysics, or in the so-called ontology and metaphysics of analytical philosophy, have different forms of answers. One kind of answer was logical empiricism. They thought that the basic objects can be somehow clusters of sense data. However, neither the word cluster, this is my word, nor the word sense data, which is or sense datum, which is used by Cranach or Ayer and Russell also. For sense data, there are no identity conditions defined, and that means there are no transsubjective objectivity at all, and therefore they cannot be the basis for knowledge. And therefore, Quine would be right to say logical positivism has the problem that it doesn't quote for the rule, no entity without identity. If I don't have identity conditions, I cannot talk about objects. So this is correct in Quine. The answer he gives is more or less, even though not always outspoken, physicalist or naturalist. He calls himself a naturalist and sometimes even a physicalist, and therefore he follows Neurath and not Cranach. Neurath is, as you know, a materialist, a naturalist, and therefore he thinks that the basic objects for a metaphysical analysis of what there is are the material things, and everything is abstraction, set abstraction. They are abstract things, but the basic things are physicalist. I call both belief philosophies, because there is no analysis of a sense data or qualia in the empiricist tradition, and there is no analysis of basic atoms and basic things independently of theory-laden concepts in the Quinean approach. So materialism and empiricism are more or less evasive insofar as they do not explain us what the domain, and it can be only a local domain, of their basic things are. And insofar, the so-called metaphysics of analytical philosophy, empiricism or materialism or objectivism, are only belief philosophies and not prima philosophia seriously taken. No metaphysics in the positive sense, but only bad metaphysics. Bad metaphysics is belief philosophy in the sense of as if we could assume without explanation and explication what we are talking about. And therefore, the notion of metaphysics now gets a positive reading and a negative reading. The negative reading is the belief philosophy, assuming basic objects as given. And Hegel is, of course, as you know, the great foe of immediacy and givenness. And and that's the other reading of metaphysics, the approach of trying to make sense and trying to explicate the constitutional basis of referring to things and talking about things and the constitution of things. And this is, of course, the positive reading, which leads from Kant via Hegel to Heidegger, in my reading. And that tries to get rid of this belief philosophy idea. Now, as you might have realized, that's the end, as you might have realized in the talking about materialism and empiricism, the word idealism didn't appear in my talk. I would like to get rid of it anyway, because there are so many misunderstandings what is going on under the title idealism. It is a title which is a polemical title from the realist people, from the materialist people, against the Platonic people who there are two readings of Platonism. And the one is in fact, or would be in fact, idealistic. Namely, already Aristotle starts with that reading, saying that the Platonists believed that the real things are forms and that everything else is appearance. This reading of Aristotle is polemical insofar as one can read Parmenides and Plato as saying, well, when we perceive something, when we apperceive something, when we judge about what we can perceive, then we already use concepts. We already use forms. But that doesn't mean, it does not mean that what we refer to are merely the forms. There are instantiations of forms. It's the methexis of the eidos. It's the sharing of the empirical thing which instantiates a possible thing of a thing of a certain kind. So it's a polemical way of putting the Platonist in this tradition. That means people who say there is no reference to any object, no joint reference without forms, without concepts, without eidos, without instantiations of possible species. So we cannot start with a mere empirical stuff of perception or sensation, because all judgments presuppose concepts. And they are polemically attacked as idealists. But they are not idealists in saying that we do not care for the empirical stuff, but they are idealists in the sense of there is no joint reference without being able to understand eidos, concepts, conceptual distinctions and conceptual identities. And in this reading, Hegel is a Platonist, but not an idealist in these traditional reading of it. And the criticism of Aristotle of Plato is in fact ambivalent, and the same holds, but that's only a side remark, for the Heideggerian story, because he attacks Plato and Aristotle for their idealism in a certain sense. I think there is some truth in it, because since then we have this ambivalent idea of eternal truth and divine knowledge and so on in the debate. But there is a positive reading which does not need the Heideggerian bad picture to say from there on we have these bad metaphysical struggle between materialism and idealism, which he wants to get rid of, as I want to too. But my means are a little bit different. I just would say, just get rid of the word idealism. It's just misleading. And the traditional talk about materialism is a problem that it's bad metaphysics. It solves the problem by not taking it seriously, by just believing that there are atoms, which is nonsense, as if they could be identity conditions for them over time, which it's just not true. Last remark, the difficulty of making this a little bit new point of view understandable and feasible has to do with the ambivalent position of the word concept. It's ambivalent insofar as the conceptual constitution is not only a constitution of formal language and formal semantics. It cannot be done independently of practical dealing with the world. And insofar, a concept is at the same time formal and material. It presupposes world-related knowledge without presupposing empirical knowledge in the sense of actual instantiations. It is a general notion about general distinctions and not particular distinction, which is empirical. And therefore, for all empirical statements, we presuppose general distinctions and identities and general possibilities. And then we discuss about empirical instantiations here and now. And any analysis of what there is and any analysis of meaning must make these two moves, talking about concept and talking about instantiations, talking about the eidos and talking about the methexis, the projection. And I think Wittgenstein came very near to this insight, but not really. So that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, this was very fruitful and very extended discussion and on so many things and questions. Okay, so right. So let's get to the questions. So please, if you do have questions, yeah, step forward and ask them. Yeah, please come, Wojtek.
Yeah, I agree that there's a positive reading to this claim that every philosophy is basically idealism, but there is also a famous negative reading. This is Sigmund Freud's now, that every philosophy is neurosis, and which is basically the same, but there's the negative touch, or but that you see that philosophers see essences where other people see tables, so. And I think that there are philosophers who are basically closer to this reading, like Wittgenstein, for example. So what about that?
Well, look, if my of course, in my picture, many parts are still white. I didn't talk about them, but Heidegger says, quite in the beginning of Sein und Zeit, that higher than actuality, Wirklichkeit, we must evaluate Möglichkeit, possibility. And this has to do with what I said. What we know in general are general possibilities. And we, in instantiations, in empirical judgments, we instantiate possibilities by saying, well, what is here is actual of that form. That means it actualizes a possibility. So conceptual knowledge belongs on the level of possibility. And now the claim is, we human beings, we do not live in the world directly, immediately, just reacting to perceptions in an active way. But it's mediated by conceptual commentaries or sentences or stream of consciousness or whatever. But that exactly delivers a nice answer. That means the philosopher knows and is more realist than the psychoanalyst about the fact that we all live in our dreams, and the matter is only to project them, the possibilities, in the right way to reality. And insofar, the Hegel, as the philosopher, would say, well, I totally agree with you that the only problem is not the philosopher. He is a realist. Is the dreamer. We all are the dreamer. So you do not realize how much idealistic your point of view of an easy distinction between what is real and what is not real is, because that is a dream. That means, in a certain sense, I agree with the skeptical point of view of Davidson. In another sense, of course, I'm a robust Hegelian, saying, well, when it comes to normal distinctions, this is not important. But from a general point of view, it's absolutely true that the way we live in the world is we at first live in the possibilities we imagine, and then we check them. And this has to do with these two levels of conceptual pre-knowledge and its application.
I completely agree with that. I wasn't voting for psychoanalysis, basically.
No, of course.
But because you know what? So Aristotle says that poetry is truer than history because it is based on possibility, basically. This is the same point.
That's the same point.
Without the idealism, So
that's exactly the same point. And the whole debate about history and if history is poetry, as you know, as we have it in auch Clio dichtet and so on, makes this point. And insofar, it's an illusion to assume that we can have a mere matter-of-fact history which deserves the name. The problem is, of course, that saying that something happened at a certain time, the event itself is, when you describe it, it's a thick event. It must have some inferential consequences, and quite indefinite ones, or else you do not know what you are talking about. When you said, well, at the Rubicon, Caesar decided to attack Rome, the sentence has a content which goes far beyond what he did just by stepping across the Rubicon. It has consequences of the form attacking means he doesn't fulfill the law, and so on and so on. So there are no empirical statements without these conceptual inferences which go indefinitely to the future. And because this is so, even though we have normally, it doesn't matter, because this is so, it's just a myth to assume that we could define the more complex statements and the more complex statements about history by elementary statements which are clear. But that's a myth. That's impossible.
Yeah, so any more questions?
If I can perhaps ask a question. That goes back to a point you raised early in your talk. That is that you seem to take the Hegelian position vis-a-vis the thing in itself. Now, I'm not so clear why it is an impossibility to stipulate that human knowledge is, as Kant says, from a human standpoint. How things may appear to entities that are not fitted out with a conceptual basis like human beings, we simply do not know. Now, in that sense, it seems to me that the thing in it, and that is one understanding of a thing in itself. It's actually a necessary limit concept that I think reflection reveals to us that we actually have to say that. So I'm not sure how. I do know Hegel says, well, you set up the limit and you are already, over the limit. But that's not. I don't think that. I can very well say that, there are things outside the way that human beings conceptualize them, and I have no way of knowing them. It makes to me perfect sense because it puts some modesty into the picture. Instead of saying, oh, you can't even think what you want to say, Immanuel Kant. No, he can. So I don't see a contradiction in that. And the very forthright sentence in the Phenomenology of Spirit, I believe it is, that he who has doubts is the one who first should leave philosophy or something like that, doesn't make any sense to me. It seems to me a perfectly reasonable position.
Oh, thank you very much, Ingo, because in a certain sense, you just rephrase the debate I have with Henning Tickmeyer. And Henning Tickmeyer would take your position with another twist in his tongue, because he's attacking Kant even more fiercely than Hegel by saying that the Ding an sich in Kant is just this label as you just described it, but what he is doing remains even more immanent than what Hegel is doing. That is what Henning says. But what my answer to Henning was, the use of the divine point of view in describing the limits of our conceptual understanding, not only the limits of our knowledge.
Yeah, conceptual.
I would agree with that insofar as we cannot use it positively for any judgment. We can have it only negative philosophy or negative theology. And then, of course, in this usage, I do not have anything against it. But in the Kantian picture, it's also used positively, and that's the
freedom.
Exactly.
Sure. But that is but you can show that Kant is contradicting himself there. Absolutely. He actually introduces it as a limit concept, and then he makes metaphysical hay with it. You can't do that. Yes, absolutely. I totally agree with that.
Absolutely, and I could even say in many cases one has to read Kant against Kant, because sometimes he has even a better reading. For example, that we have to live as if a God will judge us. There are good readings for that. But he mixes it up with bad readings, and insofar I totally agree. But the real problem is that I want to say, out of these negative concepts, we should be careful to make draw positive consequences, because when you say, yeah, well, there could be outer worldly creatures who understand things better, I do not know if we even understand what we say when we say understand.
No, I only said something about limits, right? I'm only saying the limits. I'm not going so far as to say there is a better understanding, although, that is one reading of it. I do understand that. I have a second question, if and that piggybacks on there. It's not so clear to me whether it is an epistemological debate that I have to have an absolute objectivity, in the sense that apparently this Henning wants to have it. I have a kind of, it seems to me that if you cannot explicate that absolute objectivity, you don't have it. So you either explicate it, but you can't have, some concept of it, and then say, well, you're failing with your views. Then it seems to be basically a position that I can't deliver, but I want to stick to my view. I can't have it both ways. You have to deliver. Any objective view has to be delivered, and so I'm very disappointed in that kind of empty argument. If it's not delivered, then it's not there.
Yeah. Look, I read the Hegelian point of view, which has to do with what you just said about limits. I read it that when he used the word speculative, he says this is a special way of thinking about things. It is as if we would have a high-level watchtower to look on that area. And now there are two possibilities to say, and even Jeff said it this morning, there is no possibility to see all, but there is a possibility to address all. By language, I can use the word God, or I can use the word world. And Hegel would say, we have to understand the special status of these sentences, and it would be wrong to say that they can be delivered in that sense, that I can tell you what the world is and what being is and what God is and how he sees the world. That is not the point, but we must talk about him, and therefore I said sideways on, we have to talk about sideways on. That means we must be able to use the word and make comment on it, world and God, and commenting on its possible use for expressing limitations of human being. That is possible, but and it makes sense. And in that sense, I could even take side with Wittgenstein and say, in a certain use, they are used like all reflective words, and it's no big deal. The problem is, if I have the attitude of having this direct access to objective truth, or if I have the attitude as if the sentences, the one says God has this property and the other has this property, and now you run into theological disputes. Hegel's answer is interesting because he says these are outer forms. If you have a great, this is now of course my translation, if you have a great heart, then you see all religion say the same. It's only a different way of how they express it. But what they do not do in the right way, they just articulate this finitude as the most general fact. And this is nice. And everything else what they add is proto-religion, for religion. It's not no religion at all, it's Aberglaube. So in this attitude, you see, we can deliver metaphysics, but we have to understand that it's a special way of talking about things. It's like drawing landscapes, knowing that there are only many white places in it, but it's nevertheless much more than nothing, and just for general orientation. And therefore, Hans-Georg Gadamer writes that speculari means looking in a mirror, but speculari means looking from a higher standpoint. Specula are the watchtowers at the Limes Germanicus. And therefore, speculari are these very general aphoristic statements, and therefore we come back to the aphorisms. These aphoristic comments on these general situations, which has to be read in the right way. And the whole debate about the sideways on and a few from nowhere debates have to do with the right use of such speculative comments, in my opinion.
Yeah. Isn't the talk of sideways on actually going back to Sellers, Metaphysics and Epistemology?
Yes, and McDowell takes it up, and in Henning Tegtmeyer's presentation, he takes it up merely negatively.
Yeah,
And in a certain sense, Henning agrees with me that in a certain sense it can be used only negatively, that in the sense that nobody can have that view. But in McDowell's philosophy, Henning thinks that he is doing away all speculative statements. This is not a comment, and that would be
not.
That would be.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, any more questions? Well, if nobody else has, well, I'd like to, well, ask you, well, a question that's basically going into the direction of my topic that I have presented today. So, but let me specify it a little bit. Well, I have this maybe crazy idea, reading metaphysics as dialectics, like, in Hegelian way, right? And I can think of, well, at least two types of, well, conceptual innovation. First of all, it's just when a new eidos or genus arises, like, a new subject matter, a new domain. So I don't know, like maybe like computer science, something that, well, hasn't been there, like, before until recently, or maybe something else, I don't know, molecular biology or something like that. And those domains will have, well, new forms. And now they are there and they belong into our metaphysics so that we can explicate what they are. And well, hence my question about new conceptual introductions or innovations concerning one new genus, like, how you could see how we can create it, like, something that hasn't been before in a local way, like, particular domain, like molecular biology or something. And another question is about whether we can, well, according, so in your view, whether we can innovate, like, on the large scale, something, well, I don't know, a complete overhaul what we have, like, completely new metaphysical, like, new metaphysical edifice, comparable probably to, say, like what Kant and Hegel did to metaphysics. So what do you think the conditions and the mechanisms for those are? Because you mostly speak about explication, well, and finding out the conditions of what we already have. Yeah, something like that. What do you think?
I think this is insofar a very interesting question, because it leads us back to what Jeff said in the beginning, and you also, that Hegel brings the history into these conceptual development, which I didn't care for in my talk. From Hegel's point of view, the relative presupposition of the conceptual pre-knowledge in our judgments is a logical point of view which cannot be, it's transcendental, we cannot deny it. And when we look into the history, into the past, then of course we can see that when we talk about justice or law, we presuppose an institution of law and state. But there were human beings where no state and law existed, where they happened to behave in a certain way, but at least not in the full sense of law and state and lawyer and judge. This practice didn't exist. Then it's in fact difficult to talk about what they did when they had blood revenge or whatever. Revenge is not punishment, as you know. Revenge is something else. So Hegel's point of view is we can make sense of past and actions and past ways, if we would know what they said, past sentences and propositions, only on the ground of our basic institutional distinctions from today. So when we tell the history, we tell the history from our institutional conceptual understanding backwards. And insofar, there is, from a conceptual point of view, an immanent progression, an immanent Fortschritt built in our understanding. This immanent Fortschritt is not a Fortschritt, it's not a progress talked about sideways on. It's an immanent one. And insofar there is a misunderstanding of Hegel when they assume that he talks about history sideways on. He does not. That would be wrong. Now you say, and Christian Schmidt has always the same point of view against me, that he said, we want to know about not the past, but the future, and the possibility of progress in the conceptual development. And here I'm in fact very conservative and say, since these conceptual presuppositions are institutionalized general knowledge, which are already accepted by and shared by a whole community and can be copied in all languages and so on and so on, it's absolutely difficult to say more than that this development is like all future open. And we use, of course, this in speculative way, as if we could look from the end of the world to all future, as if we could talk about that. This is important, and Hegel agrees, and I agree also, that we may talk that way, but we must be very careful when it comes to think that we can add particular features to such a point of view, because that would mean that I can talk about a future institution which doesn't exist, which is fairly difficult. But that just shows the difference between what I'm right now talking about and what you talk about when you talk about stipulated conceptual engineering, because that takes place in an already settled framework in a certain sense. Even though from a local perspective, you can say it's already trying to introduce new concepts, but in an already settled concept, in my sense. And insofar, your question has to do with coping with the future conceptually. And my answer was, we have to understand the open form of it. And that is, in fact, a problem. And we have to cope with the fact that new inventions, new institutions will change even the conceptual framework. But nevertheless, after we sit in such an institution or institutional framework, and if we conceptually remark on it, then it gets relatively absolute. This sounds crazy, but it's exactly the structure. Relatively absolute to the present way of trying to cope together with the institutional forms, the world as it is represented and commented via the institutional forms of science, knowledge, and so on. And insofar, yes, there is a time structure in conceptual development, and yes, there is a time structure, of course, in empirical judgments, and this time structure must be taken seriously, but we cannot talk about it sideways. We cannot talk about it as if we could talk about how the and insofar science fiction as an enterprise and futurology as enterprises are very nice paradigms of telling the story of the Roman Empire. That means they are going back, and therefore in science fiction, these humans always look like Greeks and Romans, just because we just use the old little bit strange forms and present them as future aliens. And insofar, from my point of view, this is a kind of historical story, which are sometimes as boring as many historical novels are. Okay.
Yes, they basically just extend what we already know and somehow configure it, and basically there is no
Exactly.
novelty usually.
Of course, there can be quite nice side effects, like for example, some of these films, like 2001 in Space, has very nice possibilities of looking at us from a constructed standpoint, which is different, and I do not deny that that can help. Of course. No. Yeah. Okay.
And maybe like one more question, and then we could conclude today's session. Well, yeah, I want to ask you, like, in the light of what you have said in your talk and now, so I want to highlight Heidegger's position, like Heidegger's his non-objectifying thinking, his poetic thinking, well, and all his talk about the new beginning. And basically, like as I see it, he's trying to overcome negation, so to speak, and basically abrupt one causal chain of cultural and historical evolution of Western society, and then like start something anew, or like kind of clear out some, I don't know, a germ that was hidden and lost and forgotten, like back in the ancient Greece, and like just to reinvigorate it and like start something completely different from the bourgeois society that he lived in. And what do you hold of his attempt? I mean, does it look plausible, like my description of it? And so what do you think, like is this viable in general, or like how we should approach this non-objectifying poetic thinking? I mean, was it wrong, or like has it got any future in philosophical sense?
Well, I think Ingo would agree that your question is a little bit too big, because what you ask is the whole would result in a whole analysis of what Heidegger is doing. I can only
just a sketch, like
I don't give remarks on some. Of course, when Heidegger says modern philosophy of language is not philosophy of language, it's only philosophy of mathematics, he would be right. Or when he says, well, the problem of 2000 years after Aristotle of philosophy is that the scientific point of view is gaining ground, and forgetting that science and techniques are things which belong to human institutions and our own forming our lives. And then we set ourselves inside of such a self-told story and a self-told enterprise without forgetting the real Dasein in as taking part. We are just objects in that picture. And all these singular observations are very important and true. I think the main point is that he dreams of, he talks about an authentic way of being humans together without falling into the traps of telling a story of progress in science, progress in technique, where we are the small ants taking part in such an enterprise, knowing quite well that nevertheless, in fact, we cannot get rid of these dependence of Ereignis, events which go far beyond our means as individuals. So what he thinks is that the self-understanding of human being got darkened by the scientific point of view and by the Platonistic and scientific reading of Christianity, because Christianity in itself has, in his position, as he sees it, much less the joint action perspective, much more the perspective of a view on us sideways on. And that is his attack of Christianity. That means it's as if morals and ethical things come from side as a demand of a God, and not as our self-understanding as persons in a joint community of persons. So his attack of Christianity is similar to Nietzsche. I think they are also a little bit unfair, but their picture is interesting because it's a picture which parallels the Platonism or Pythagoreanism in scientism and Christianity. You know, and that is interesting. And then, and in addition, there is this Homo economicus picture, which the Christians want to get rid of, but at the same time, they remain in it. And I think when we understand the critical impact of Heidegger, the critical impact that our self-view are so traditional, either scientific, materialistic, or Christian, with not even understanding the ethics of Christianity, just continuing it in utilitarianism, then his critical point of view are much more interesting than the question how to get rid of these misunderstandings. Even though he is skeptical against philosophy, I think his deep hope is that in unification of literature and philosophy, we can cope with it. So he just is skeptical against academic philosophy. He is not skeptical about the importance of philosophical elucidations together with literature and poetry. And
because it's thinking.
Yes, exactly. That's the only point. So he is just trying to escape the academic way of doing philosophy.
Sure. But I just, Dennis, if I can chip in here, I think it's important that when Heidegger talks about the second beginning, he usually is careful enough to add a cautious note on the preparatory work that is needed. So this is not science fiction that you were just referring to. This is not a blueprint. It is, however, an attempt to be, he says, being more attuned to the words than literature. He doesn't mean, so he means the fast literature that he wants to get rid of. So, but it's very important that he is, by all means, also claiming that is, of course, very controversial, but the way that the world is revealed today through technology and the enframing and so on and so forth, that is in part how being is revealed today or in our epoch. There is a truth to it, and you cannot switch it off and on. In fact, it is Heidegger who develops his concept of equanimity or Gelassenheit, releasement, with regard to technology, where he says, well, we can all use our iPhones The important point is not to get totally invested in all the gadgets that there are about, that we have to also let go. But you can switch on your TV if you have to, and watch a soccer game, which he would do. And well, he didn't have a TV; he would have to go to friends and watch the soccer game there, which he did. So I think he is, when he's talking about the preparatory, the preparations, that's where he is at. And also one more thing, I heard something where you said, I don't think that he's going back in history. What he understands is that we can only understand our own way if we work through history. But he doesn't think that there is, a form of life or a form of thought that has been realized in the past to which we could return. He only thinks that we, so to that extent, he is really modern. He thinks it's the next step. And he wants to have that in the right direction. He's very concerned that, like Max Weber, that we are in this cage and don't have a way out. He wants to open a way out, and he's clever enough to understand, well, we as philosophers can't just, write up another utopia or something like that. That's another Atlantis. That's not going to work. So to that extent, there is a modesty built into it. It is also in his vocabulary, it is what being sends itself. So without, being participating in the way of getting rid of this kind of way in which we treat the planet, there is no way forward. I think that's at least how I read it. So he's a very, I read him as a modest person, actually, after, he learned something from his, from the 30s.
Ingo, I couldn't agree more. I totally agree with that. I just wanted to show examples. For example, look into the history of modern linguistics. Then you see after Chomsky has a great impact. And but from a certain point of view, the Chomskyan and Montague's and David Lewis's way of dealing with language is technical.
Yes.
Language is more or less automatic language processing, and there is no question that it's a way we can and must even understand part of languages. But the danger is when we really would follow Chomsky and say, well, this is the way we think, then we would continue exactly that trap of a technical point of view, and therefore making clear that there are these dangers is what Heidegger is doing, without having idealistic ideas that we could. And that's exactly what I always have in a debate with Christian Schmidt, my own student, who wants to make of the Ereignis and Heidegger a positive device or advice how we should continue the institutions. And I think this is too much to expect from him. And I totally agree. Yeah.
And it's also what you said. I mean, Heidegger really does, as you said, he values the possibilities over actuality. So it is that too. He doesn't want to, being incarcerated in one cage, he doesn't want to open up another one. It is precisely, and to that extent, it is Martin Heidegger who, in his own way, has a concept of freedom. It is being free and to the open. It is not being subservient to another doctrine. It is opening up and seeing that the technological age is, rather monotonous and producing rather unwelcome results. I think we can all agree with that.
Yeah.
Although we can only meet because of technology. That's the problem.
Yes, I totally agree. And the interesting point here is that just coming back to speculative statements, Heidegger would be a little bit more skeptical than I am. But normally people would say, well, the inferences, the consequences are so dizzy and unclear. The only clear information you get when you talk about matters of facts but that's not true, because the grand orientations in the openness of our world are so important that we very often underestimate them. And therefore, it's so complicated to bring that into a language which is not by itself already a misunderstanding. It will never be in a language everybody can understand, that's clear, and it at least not without preparatory help. But on the other hand, this game of developing reflecting languages, now I talk about in the plural, from Hölderlin in literature to Heidegger, and you take Adorno, you can even take Nietzsche and his aphorisms, or other approaches. They are so needed just because to articulate overviews about our situations is something else and more difficult than developing subatomic particles.
Can I just add, it is not only Hölderlin that Heidegger references. There is indeed in volume 13 a piece, Vivant Rimbaud. So he's actually having a piece on Arthur Rimbaud, who is, I believe, one of the most modern poets, and Heidegger is knowledgeable in his piece. It's a short piece, but he writes about him, and it's quite interesting. What does Rimbaud do? Opening up. And it's so interesting. So the fact that he's able to write about Rimbaud shows me, I mean, I have, Dennis, you know, I have my own interpretation. I read Heidegger as a modernist of sorts. And but that is, you know, that's what he's after. So it is the possibilities. That's the open. And that, yeah. Okay, we agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Love that.